It was just a couple of days ago the Green Party activists and candidates said that made a series of horrible anti-Semitic comments, including describing Jews, and I quote, I hesitate to quote, but I will do it, calling them abominations on humanity. And they also claimed that the attacks, the arson attacks on the Jewish charity ambulance were a, quote, false flag. A Green Party council candidate made that.
Welcome back to Julian Discourse. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from today. And if you want unapologetic political accountability, hit that subscribe button right now. We all know the establishment media's playbook. Ignore the actual policies, trap the guest, and control the narrative. That's exactly what the BBC's Laura Kuenssberg tried to do when Reform Party's Zia Yusuf came on air to discuss the crippling cost of net zero and Reform's plan to slash energy bills. Instead of actually debating the economics of those energy policies, she immediately tried to corner him on candidate vetting to paint his party as undisciplined. She expected him to apologize and back down. Instead, he flipped the script. Yusuf refused to accept her slanted framing and went straight on the attack, launching a surgical, real-time exposure of the BBC's own glaring hypocrisy and blatant double standards. Watch what happens when an establishment journalist suddenly realizes she is the one being interrogated.
And diesel prices by 14p a litre.
How are you going to pay for that then? So let's look at taking VAT off energy bills. That would be roughly, we expect, to cost about £2.5 billion. Where would the money for that come from?
Yeah, so let's talk about that. So this is more than covered by stop spending British taxpayer money on things that don't improve their lives. So we'd scrap the electric car subsidies. We would end the subsidies on heat pumps in your boiler. And we would end the insane experiment that's currently going on. £9 billion over the course of this Parliament, Labour is spending of British taxpayers' money on carbon capture experiments. Cumulatively, over the 5-year period, that is £14 billion, Laura. That more than covers all of the measures we're taking to reduce cost of living for British people.
But wouldn't then heat pumps, which some people want to put into their houses in order to bring their bills down in the long term, electric cars, which some people want to drive in order to live a more environmentally friendly life, or maybe they just like the look of them, and both of those industries support jobs in this country. So wouldn't costs go up and jobs in green industries be under threat by those decisions?
First of all, this is a fallacy. China is currently flooding this country with cheap Chinese electric cars. Currently, those levies that British taxpayers' money is being spent on are producing jobs and creating jobs in China and costing them in this country. And yes, let's be completely frank. It is, if somebody's watching this programme and desperately wants a heat pump in their house, yeah, you're not going to get that subsidy under Reform government. But people watching this programme who fill their petrol cars up and their diesel cars up and wince and fear opening their energy bills, all of that would reverse under a Reform government.
What about if you work, though, in a green industry? Maybe you're involved in a wind farm, maybe you work for a renewables company. When you hear again and again Reform saying, oh, we would take the subsidies away from that, they might feel like the rug's going to be pulled under them.
So, Laura,
this few months, given everything that's happened in the Middle East. I just want to mention in the context of the elections coming. Reform's had a pretty turbulent week with some of its candidates. One of them branded the former First Minister of Scotland, Zia Yusuf, an Islamist moron. Another candidate made offensive comments aimed at the Jewish community. Another was photographed doing a Nazi salute. Now, Nigel Farage told us last year your vetting process would improve, it would be rigorous, that you would not have the same kind of problems that you had in the general election with candidates. That doesn't seem to have worked, does it?
Well, look, firstly, obviously, all of that's abhorrent and the party's taken action on that.
But why does it keep happening?
Look, Laura, Reform has vetted over 8,000 candidates over the last couple of years. Even if our success rate is 99.9%, a handful will slip through. But I want to make a very important point, actually, on vetting and how these things are covered. Because, yes, of course, it's reasonable to hold Reform to account. But what consistently happens is the BBC pounces on every single Reform mishap and gives it vastly disproportionate coverage in your news cycles and completely ignores the far more voluminous misdemeanours and, frankly, egregious things that people from other parties say. Let me give you a real example.
Proportionately, Zia Yusuf, proportionately, Reform has lost more councillors over this kind of thing happening than the other political parties.
That is actually incorrect. That's actually incorrect, right? And I want to make an important point, because it was just a couple of days ago the Green Party activists and candidates said that made a series of horrible anti-Semitic comments, including describing Jews, and I quote, I hesitate to quote, but I will do it, calling them abominations on humanity. And they also claimed that the arson attacks on the Jewish charity ambulance were a, quote, false flag. A Green Party council candidate made that.
What you just witnessed is the exact moment the establishment media's favorite weapon was entirely dismantled on live television. For years, the mainstream press has relied on a very specific, highly predictable playbook whenever they are forced to interview a political outsider. They ignore the substance of the platform and instead launch a relentless, bad faith interrogation over procedural issues or minor controversies. Look closely at the power dynamics of how this interview began. Laura Kuenssberg had absolutely no intention of having a serious, good faith debate about the catastrophic economic realities of net zero. She knows, just as the entire political establishment knows, that the public is completely exhausted by green subsidies that drive up their energy bills while enriching foreign markets. Because she cannot win the argument on the economics, she attempts to invalidate the messenger, aggressively cornering Zia Yusuf on candidate vetting and data collection. The goal is to put him on the defensive, force an apology, and control the narrative. But the playbook failed because Zia Yusuf refused to play the assigned role of the submissive guest. Instead, he executed a masterclass in political framing. By refusing to back down and instantly pivoting to the BBC's own glaring double standards, Yusuf didn't just win a debate point. He exposed the entire structural bias of the network. When he brings up the horrific documented anti-Semitism from Green Party activists, a story the BBC conveniently chose to ignore, he strips away Kuenssberg's journalistic shield. He forces the audience to see that the BBC is not acting as a neutral arbiter of truth. They are acting as a political enforcer, weaponizing their massive platform to disproportionately amplify the mistakes of a populist party while running defense for the progressive left. This is exactly why public trust in legacy media is currently in a state of total collapse. The British public is forced, under threat of prosecution, to pay a TV license fee to fund a broadcaster that actively treats their political concerns with contempt. Working class voters are struggling to heat their homes, and when a politician comes on air offering a concrete plan to slash those bills by cutting green subsidies, the BBC's first instinct is to try and smear him. But this exchange proves that the era of uncontested media gatekeeping is over. Politicians who actually understand modern media dynamics are no longer terrified of establishment journalists. They understand that the cameras run both ways. Zia Yusuf proved that when you bring the receipts, maintain absolute composure, and refuse to accept their slanted framing, the establishment media's authority shatters instantly. They rely entirely on compliance, and the moment you stop complying, they are exposed for exactly what they are: